Scares, action, tense encounters, survival. The Resident Evil series has it all. The original survival horror masterpiece that started it all almost 30 years ago has evolved and been iterated upon, yielding some of the greatest tense gameplay and scares in all of gaming. Today, we're taking an in-depth look at the absolute scariest games in all of Resident Evil, before going into the scariest moments across the series. That's right, it's a 2-for-1 deal in this one, where we start out by ranking the scariest games across the entire franchise before taking a look at the scariest moments in the core Resident Evil games. As always, share your own lists in the comments below and strap yourself in for a deep look at the scariest games and moments across Resident Evil. First, let's look at the scariest Resident Evil games, starting with least scariest to the scariest. Get down! Excellent light gun style game, but just light on the scares. In at dead last for the scariest Resident Evil game is Resident Evil: The Dark Side Chronicles. Although this shooter was undeniably fun, the game just wasn't very scary. Unlike the gun survivor games that we'll later rank, these Chronicles games for the Wii lacked the tension of those earlier first-person gun games, as this on-rails format eliminated much of the tension in favor of more scripted action. While very similar to Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles that came before it, I feel like the lighter, more colorful color palette and general scenarios featured in the Dark Side Chronicles make this just a bit less scary, resulting in the least scary Resident Evil game thus far.
Let's go. Time to kick some ass.
Welcome to the Umbrella Chronicles.
The game that came before it, Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles, is the other Wii shooter that is just a tad scarier, simply due to its more dreary settings and environments, of which take place during iconic moments in the earlier Resident Evil games. Facing off against Yawn from Resident Evil 1, escaping a zombie-infested train from Resident Evil 0, and re-experiencing Hunk's The Fourth Survivor mode all in a light gun format was awesome, and while the game is simply a good time, don't expect the scripted action to haunt your memories here. Taking a break from the first-person Resident Evils for a bit, we have Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City next.
Tries to use force on any hostiles.
While the game isn't very scary and is entirely a third-person action shooter, its setting in Raccoon City during its most haunting time makes this game sit where it's currently at. This squad-based shooter is a high-octane ride through Raccoon City's darkest hours, and its focus on action and co-op play is what makes it sit so low on the scares list. If you enjoy unloading a ton of lead into zombies with a massive roster of 12 playable characters, you'll feel right at home here. Time to ditch the Wiimotes and get out those light guns in the good old PS1, because Resident Evil Survivor is up next. Although a great deal more atmospheric than its over-the-top arcade relatives in the House of the Dead series, Survivor instead allows for full character movement akin to a first-person shooter around its tight, narrow maps, while offering us the precision by way of the light gun controller. Featuring a sparse color palette and a decidedly greater focus on action, Resident Evil Survivor felt more like an action game with some good atmosphere. This game featured tons of zombies and some iconic boss characters from the PS1 era of games, but the quality of these character models looked a bit better in their mainline counterparts, and often came across as quite jarring here. Still, there's plenty of tense action to be had in Resident Evil Survivor. In line with the first-person Survivor games, Resident Evil Survivor 2 Code Veronica is next. With better graphical fidelity with the game on the PS2 hardware and sporting more eerie locations within the Code Veronica campaign, like the torture room and various other locations on Rockford Island, this game just inches past the previous Survivor game in terms of tension and scares. The greater enemy diversity this game sports certainly plays into that, as all manner of bugs, T-virus zombies, and iconic boss creatures can be found here. Do you like the mercenaries? Well, this game is all about the mercenaries, in Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D for the 3DS. Choose between an incredible amount of Resident Evil characters across tons of different maps spanning the franchise, and you have a fun arcade-style game that you can take with you on the go. Its arcadey action and high-energy music makes this Resident Evil title not so scary, but a whole lot of fun. The game can certainly be tense as you race against the clock, trying to get the high score while your enemies try to cut you down though. The graphics of the 3DS were truly tested here, resulting in one of the best looking Resident Evil games on the go. Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 was a solid expansion to the previous Outbreak game, adding 5 new scenarios with the original 8 characters returning from Resident Evil Outbreak. This game put players back in the T-virus infested Raccoon City. Serving more as an expansion than an entirely new game, much of the tension and atmosphere from the missions that were added here didn't quite hit as hard as the core Outbreak game, but it was still a very atmospheric experience and was clearly ahead of its time with its online functionality.
Line up!
If you are horrified by QuickTime events, like a lot of them, then Resident Evil 6 will likely be the scariest Resident Evil game in all of Resident Evil. Incredibly ambitious with 4 campaigns and a robust mercenaries mode with co-op, Resident Evil 6 falls into the camp of being a bit too heavy on the action for most Resident Evil fans out there. While certain parts of the game are definitely eerie and atmospheric, these parts of the game were short-lived and were mainly tied to early moments in Leon's campaign. I especially like the Elusija boss fight with Chris Redfield, and feel like the action build-up was appropriately pulled off here. As much as Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5 had plenty of action, Resident Evil 6 went complete Michael Bay with many of its set-piece moments, and its fast-paced third-person shooting made some fans feel like the series lost sight of what made it so great in the first place. Even so, Resident Evil 6 certainly has some great atmosphere and tension in spots. It's just that you may have to sift through long stretches of the game to get to them. Leaning more into the action here over Resident Evil 4, but a bit more toned down when compared to Resident Evil 6, Resident Evil 5 is next, featuring a setting that was perhaps the least threatening and truly scary than any other setting we've seen the series take us thus far. The sun-drenched areas of the game don't do much to increase your anxiety, and while its opening moments featured some genuinely effective bits of tension and atmosphere, the rest of the game fails to match that moment's heights. Sure, the crocodile-infested marshlands introduced some solid jump scares, and the excellent story DLC found in the Lost Nightmares expansion featuring the Spencer Mansion were among the game's greatest moments for scares, but the rest of the package doesn't quite stack up to the various other mainline entries that came before it. Bringing to the table 8 characters with unique abilities, a variety of missions set within Raccoon City during the events of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, sporting both single-player and cooperative play, Resident Evil Outbreak is often considered the best multiplayer Resident Evil game among those who played it. In today's climate, with the internet being readily available, a remake or a game similar to this style would probably do quite well, as this was one of the premier console games to feature online multiplayer on the PS2. As far as scares and tension were concerned, this game had great atmosphere and very solid survival mechanics. The lighting was eerie, and the sound design and presentation all culminated in a set of missions that were designed to make players uneasy as they ventured through Raccoon City, either alone or with other players online. While it wasn't as scary as many of the mainline installments, this game was celebrated for its online systems, resource management, and its dark, eerie tone. For those who played it, many would argue Resident Evil 0 is the hardest game in all of Resident Evil. Managing the inventory of 2 characters, Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen, as they frantically try to survive creepy moments like leech-infested death chambers and an unsettling train taken over by zombies, Resident Evil 0 tested players' skills and guts like few other Resident Evil games did before it, or after it for that matter. A prequel to the original Resident Evil, Resident Evil 0's atmosphere and tension hits harder when you struggle to keep these 2 characters alive, juggling resources between the two as you try to make it out alive. The enemy designs here are great, and while the scares don't quite hit the high notes of many of the games before and after it, Resident Evil 0 is a worthwhile game to play, even with its admittedly frustrating gameplay. Resident Evil Dead Aim is the final game in the Resident Evil Survivor series, and unlike the previous Survivor games in which they were controlled in the first person, Dead Aim instead has players navigate the character in third person before shifting to the first person perspective to carry out the shooting. This transition, along with better graphics and faster gameplay, made Dead Aim stand out as a freakier experience than the previous Survivor titles. It's too bad that the game sold so bad, selling less than 50,000 total copies. And if you were ever curious about the best and worst selling Resident Evil games of all time, watch this video here on your screen, also linked in the description.
Don't worry, Claire. I'm coming to save you.
A well-loved and highly requested entry to get a remake, Resident Evil Code Veronica is not only a solid classic Resident Evil game, but also one with some good tension and scares. Released initially on the Sega Dreamcast before making its way over to the PS2 and GameCube, Code Veronica follows Claire and Chris Redfield across Rockford Island and beyond in T-virus infested areas that were quite frightening. The torture chambers on Rockford Island certainly stand out here, and as a kid, fighting against Nosferatu in the midst of a violent blizzard were among the most frightening moments here. This is very much a classic Resident Evil through and through, with fixed camera angles and emphasis on survival with some great music and atmosphere. Let's hope this game gets the remake it deserves. Nemesis is back, but this time, he's not as intimidating as he once was back in 1999. Resident Evil 3 Remake, for as fun as it was, lacked many elements about the original game that made it so unique. Gone were the Nemesis scenarios, whole sections were cut, etc. But we're not going to talk about what could have been here. The creepiest moments of the game were undoubtedly with Carlos, as we scoured the hospital looking for a vaccine to cure Jill Valentine. It wasn't until we got to the upper floors of this dimly lit hospital that we got introduced to the hunters for the first time in the game. The tight and narrow hallways made for some great tension as we made our way through, listening closely for whatever could be behind the next door. It's too bad that the scripted encounters with Nemesis made him feel much more like an annoyance than something truly threatening and terrifying in the remake. The game that started it all, Resident Evil for the PS1, was a beast of a game. Not only was it groundbreaking for its time, but it was truly frightening. No one will forget the first scene with the zombie becoming alerted to your presence, nor will we forget the dogs crashing through the windows in one of the most iconic jump scares in gaming. We can't also forget about the hunters too, right? Resident Evil, for as scary as the game was, doesn't hit quite as hard as many of the games that immediately came after it, but its legacy lives on and is still a haunting setting to go through, even with how jarring the graphics and voice acting may be.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Insane asylums, eerie villages, crazy enemy designs. Sounds like solid ingredients for a scary game, right? Resident Evil Revelations 2 is that game, featuring some truly unsettling locations, great enemy designs, and unique gameplay. The virus mainly featured in Revelations 2, the T-Phobos virus, is fascinating, and its lore has haunting impacts on many of the creatures we come to face within the game. Definitely take a look at this video going over some of the deadliest viruses and infections in all of Resident Evil to get more insight into the abominations that were produced in this game. But in general, Revelations 2 is a solid Resident Evil title, and while an uneven second half may not have been the ideal way to see its narrative come to a conclusion, this title's shortcomings don't wash away the brilliance of its best moments. Do you fear what lurks beneath the water? Maybe don't play this next game, as Resident Evil Revelations puts us in the shoes of Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, and others as we navigate a stranded and very much haunted and decaying cruise ship in the middle of the sea. Similar to games like Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2, claustrophobic and dimly lit corridors are very much prevalent here, along with the oozes, the main enemies you'll be facing off here. You've got tense boss encounters, creepy enemy designs, and horrifying clashes with fellow friends who succumb to the T-Abyss virus, just waiting to jump at you as you try to rid the threat on board the ship. We can't ignore the horrifying element of Rachel Foley, as she plays a terrifying game of hide and seek with you throughout the ship, nor the encounter with the ship's captain, as he fights to stay alive as he succumbs to the virus eating away at him. Revelations is a proper survival horror game, and one that all fans of the series should definitely check out.
You know you're kinda cute without those glasses. Give me your number when I get back.
May I remind you that you're still on duty?
Story of my life.
No amount of Leon's cheesy one-liners will prevent the original Resident Evil spot from being higher on this list. With its highly atmospheric locations, killer soundtrack, excellent sound design, and incredible gun feedback, Resident Evil 4 is an incredible action horror title that plays quite well to this day. While the remake may have improved upon the gameplay here, the original Resident Evil 4 is really what ushered in a new era for Resident Evil. Instead of sticking with the fixed camera angles and tank controls, Capcom got creative and ushered in the era of over-the-shoulder third-person shooting, and did so with incredible finesse. What we got was an up-close and personal look at staring down the Ganados and these particular abominations head-on. Littered throughout the game were incredibly memorable encounters, like the iconic village throwdown, the regenerator encounters, and the cage fight with U3 to name but a few. Resident Evil 4 was the real deal and the complete package, showcasing a beefy campaign, a small campaign with Ada and Assignment Ada, an awesome mercenaries mode, and if you had the PS2 edition onward, you were treated with Separate Ways, a proper campaign starring Ada Wong. It is atmospheric and spooky as hell in spots, and while it doesn't outshine some of the scares from games that came both before and after it, it is still a well-balanced action horror title that has withstood the test of time.
Stars.
The original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is an incredible Resident Evil game, one that began to take the series more into the realm of action while still firmly holding on to its horror roots. The result was a tour de force through Raccoon City and a campaign parallel to the events of Resident Evil 2. But this time, Jill Valentine has the night of her life, as the tyrant Nemesis persists on hunting her down all throughout the city. Playing this game for the first time is an experience like no other, because not only are there more zombies coming at you, but you have the unpredictability of Nemesis just waiting to jump out at you seemingly around every corner. And when he encounters you, they provide some of the most insane jump scares in all of gaming. I will never forget this moment when walking down the stairs of the RPD, only to have Nemesis burst through the window at the bottom. But it doesn't end there. Being provided the option to either face Nemesis head-on or to escape made the game more tense, as the fights with him were brutal, yet yielded great rewards. But there was always the question of what would happen if you decided to run away. The replayability in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is a lasting accomplishment that was sorely missed in its remake, and while that very remake didn't provide the scares and insidious terror of the original game, that's all the more reason to jump back into this classic Resident Evil title.
In life and in death, we give glory. The bell tolls for us all. They're coming again!
Resident Evil Village is a fascinating game. Some may be surprised to see why it's so high up on this list, but in all honesty, this game, for me at least, provided a few of the most chilling horror sequences in not just Resident Evil, but all of horror in gaming. The baby in House Beneviento still gets me, especially in VR, but even without experiencing the game in VR, the atmosphere in many parts of the game is just masterfully done. Whether you're in Castle Dimitrescu, hunting down the 3 lady bloodsuckers, or being hunted by Lady D herself, or encountering the number of abominations haunting the narrow corridors in Heisenberg's factory, these moments offset the increased focus on action over the more horror-focused outing with Ethan Winters and RE7. We also can't dismiss the DLC story expansion in Shadow of Rose, where that game, too, hides some of the series' best scares. Without these moments, the game would be just a tad lower on this list, but even so, Resident Evil 8 nailed the creepy European village tone with its thick atmosphere, memorable villains, and personal first-person gameplay. We've made it to the top 5, and let me remind you to let me know in the comments what you believe to be the scariest Resident Evil game. And of course, feel free to drop a like and subscribe to the channel to push this video out to more people. I've got tons of other Resident Evil content on this channel, including rankings just like this, so binge watch all the lore and ranking videos to your heart's content after you watch this one all the way through. Speaking of a game you should play all the way through, and yes, that's with every character, even on their alternate campaigns, the original Resident Evil 2 happens to be not only a content-rich experience, but also one of the scariest Resident Evils out there. Being able to play as either Leon or Claire, we guide our unfortunate protagonists through some of the creepiest locations ever to conceive a video game. The RPD's iconic labyrinth of rooms and narrow-lit corridors make for some of the greatest encounters in all of Resident Evil, along with the harrowing sewer system and underground labs to explore. We first get exposed to the G-Virus here, along with an entire population of humans now transformed due to the T-Virus infecting almost everyone and everything it touches. The brilliant zapping system, allowing characters to experience completely different scenarios on consecutive playthroughs, is really what continues to surprise players even when going through the same locations again. This unpredictability, coupled with the tyrant Mr. X being introduced on each character's B scenarios, adds even more stress to an already stressful game. This is survival horror at its finest here in the original Resident Evil 2, as every item, weapon, and decision you make have great impacts on your survivability here. This game, in my opinion, also has some of the best music composed for any Resident Evil, and sets the tone of the events that transpired that fateful night. It was either going to be Resident Evil 4 Remake or Resident Evil 2 that was going to get the number 5 spot, but I felt like, for me, it was the enhanced graphics, sound design, and atmosphere of Resident Evil 4 Remake that ultimately put it on top to earn the number 4 spot. The original RE4 was indeed an atmospheric game, featuring some creepy sections, like the opening battle in the village, the Regenerator encounters, and Ashley's section. But the remake just took those moments and more, and added many additional layers of tension and atmosphere that gives it that edge. The game just has a creepy and insidious tone to it. It is unsettling and oddly quiet in some areas, only to have the game turn the tables on you and have you face off with what seems like insurmountable challenges. This is exactly what a remake should be. Not a one-to-one remake predictably playing out exactly as we remember it, but subverting our expectations to make us simultaneously go, "Oh, okay, I see what they did there," and "Oh shit," all at once. This is all the more evident with Ada's incredible Separate Ways DLC that recently hit the game, not only expanding on the base lore of the game, but also including some fan-favorite moments from the original that were cut from the remake's campaign. Resident Evil 4 Remake is one of the greatest action horror games ever made, and it is truly a fantastic remake of one of gaming's most beloved titles. And at third place, we have the remake of Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 Remake is nightmare fuel this time around, and honestly, as creepy as the original Resident Evil 2 was, the remake made everything so much more atmospheric with every single environment in the game. Not only were the corridors of the RPD much darker, but the sewers were much nastier, freaking gross, and sported some of the most unsettling designs in any Resident Evil game. Mr. X, instead of being allocated to B scenarios, was introduced early on in the campaign, forcing the player to contend with a tall dude in a trench coat hell-bent on sucker punching you all throughout the RPD, his heavy footsteps vibrating violently throughout the creaking floorboards of the police station, instilling deep within the player a sense of dread. The transition to the over-the-shoulder format here was a huge win for this remake, as it made the action much more personal and terrifying, while also introducing the game to millions of people that otherwise were put off by the tank controls and fixed camera angles of gaming's past. Resident Evil 2 Remake, even with all of its faults, especially in the lackluster B scenarios, more than makes up for its shortcomings with one of the most memorable survival horror campaigns out there. Speaking of fixed camera angles, the remake of the original Resident Evil is another prime example of nightmare fuel, and successfully remakes one of the most important video games of our time, yet expands upon it in almost every conceivable way. The controls are better, the graphics are better, the story has been more fleshed out, more areas have been added, and of course, more enemies too. These enemies and enhanced graphics are really what make the game as terrifying as it is. Still, to this day, the Crimson Heads are unlike anything else out there in Resident Evil, making you think twice about which zombies you should incinerate with matches and which ones you should spare. For those that you think you killed will likely reanimate and chase you throughout the Spencer Mansion, with an intensity and lust to end your life faster than you may reach the next door to escape. Not only the Crimson Heads were added here, we can't not address Lisa Trevor, the new addition to the remake, as her slumbering and shackled body, along with her painful moans, will haunt you throughout your playthrough. The new additions, along with its better presentation, still provide incredible spooks and scares to this day, and while it may be a controversial opinion, a remake of this remake would be the best. Spencer Mansion's haunted hallways have never looked this good before, but man, can they look and feel much better in a remake. And finally at number 1, it's Resident Evil 7.
Be careful. They'll be looking for you.
It's no question for me whatsoever that this game was deliberately designed to take the franchise back to its survival horror roots after the contested Resident Evil 6, and this one was the revitalization that we never thought we would get, but something we wanted for a long while. Sure, the game lacks enemy variety with the molded, but it's the decayed setting, dilapidated environments, switched to first person, and truly freaky encounters with the Baker residents that make this game stand heads and shoulders scarier above the rest of Resident Evil. The game is just ruthless, hitting hard right from the start of the game, with brutal encounters that showcase the new direction and its increased focus on horror, and bringing back the survival aspect of the series that has seemingly been forgotten. It was a technical wonder, debuting the RE engine, allowing all to see how gross the molded can be, how haunting its corridors can look, and how visceral its action can feel. It's a fantastic game. No, not the best Resident Evil title out there, in my opinion, but easily the scariest Resident Evil game yet. From Jack Baker's tenacity to whatever the heck happened to Marguerite, to exploring the haunted wrecked ship and the terrifying corners of the Baker Mansion, Resident Evil 7 is the scariest game to ever hit Resident Evil.
This fucking family.
The ball is in your corner now, folks, so do me a solid and let me know what you think is the scariest Resident Evil game of them all in the comments below. We just finished a big list of the scariest Resident Evil games, but now it's time to talk about the scariest moments in all of Resident Evil. For this upcoming list, we will only be taking into account the mainline entries and Revelations spin-off titles, ranking each game's singular scariest moment against the rest. If you disagree with these moments or want to add to them, sound off in the comments below. So without further ado, let's muster up some courage and take the elevator down to the depths of the scariest moments Resident Evil has to offer.
Oh my god!
To start this list off, we are going to take a look at Resident Evil 0. I have to say, I didn't find Resident Evil 0 to have many noteworthy scary moments that really jumped out at me. The hunters in the underground bunker provided some solid encounters, but what many remember fondly of Resident Evil 0 are its enemy designs, and for me personally, the Queen Leech encounters take the cake here. The nasty twitching of this boss as it stalks you around the arena trying to crush you to death was certainly harrowing, along with the second encounter where it ambushes you at the top of the lift. These boss encounters are what I remember most fondly of Resident Evil 0, and you can't dismiss how creepy these boss designs are here. I know many of you wouldn't say Resident Evil 0 is a particularly scary game, but let me know in the comments what you deem to be the scariest moment in Resident Evil 0. Revelations 2 is another great Resident Evil game that doesn't get a lot of attention. While to me there aren't many standout moments that are truly scary, the game's tense atmosphere is in prime display throughout the game. I think the encounters with the Revenant enemy type are quite memorable, as they are quite formidable. Speedy when they need to close the distance and eager to pulverize the player with their grabs, these disgusting, severely mutated humans from the T-Phobos virus are perhaps the enemies that stand out most against all others in Revelations 2. They are more freaky to look at than any other enemy type in the game, and combine that with the thick atmosphere of Revelations 2, and you have the recipe for some proper fears in this unique Resident Evil title. Resident Evil 5 gets a lot of love and hate for varying reasons, and while I won't get into that here, we can all agree that it is perhaps the Resident Evil game with the least number of scares. Because of that, I had a hard time picking a scary moment here, although some can certainly be frightening. While the unexpected nature of the crocodiles roaming around the marshlands do put up some solid frights, the creepiest moments undoubtedly go to the Lost in Nightmares DLC found in Resident Evil 5, as we explore the creepy and claustrophobic corridors and passages of Spencer Mansion with Chris and Jill. The tension is palpable, and the encounters within are easily some of the most haunting in the game. This is an awesome return to the Spencer Mansion, and is one of the best DLCs you can find in all of Resident Evil. It all started in 1996, when players were introduced to the Spencer Mansion in the very first Resident Evil. While this game is considered the father of the survival horror genre and was indeed a scary game back in the day, some of the scares present in the original Resident Evil game don't scare quite as hard now as they used to. Many Resident Evil fans remember the dog jump scare as being one of the most alarming moments of the very first game, and while I agree that it was certainly a startling moment, I believe the introduction of the hunters is certainly more frightening. Not only are these beasts much more challenging to take down than the dogs, but it instilled a sense of dread in the player, letting us know that, well, now that we've returned to the mansion after clearing the guardhouse, that we now have an unknown number of these hunters just lurking around, ready to come clawing at us at any given moment. It's like playing Subnautica and just knowing that there are all manner of Reaper Leviathans out there, just waiting to sink their menacing mandibles into your flesh. The Spencer Mansion was something entirely different with these hunters roaming about. While I loved the dynamic camera system introduced to Code Veronica back in the day, I ultimately found the game to be light on the scares, especially coming after Resident Evil 2 and 3 before it. That said, the torture room on Rockford Island had great atmosphere and a creepy soundtrack accompanying it, but I think the boss fight, Nosferatu, is the scariest moment in the game. While not entirely horrifying, the blizzard-like conditions in which we fight the boss with the limited visibility certainly aids to the atmosphere. There's nothing like looking down the scope of your rifle and seeing this menace staring you down. Its constant poison attacks and Claire's constant shrieking do dampen an otherwise tense fight, but a remake of this game could absolutely make this encounter all the spookier. Moving on to the divisive Resident Evil 6, RE6 is a massive game. Featuring a handful of campaigns sporting classic Resident Evil characters, there really is a lot going on here, but maybe not so much in the scare department. While I feel like Leon's campaign does a pretty good job in offering some of the traditional scares found throughout the franchise, I found that the serpent boss fight, Luzaja, does a pretty good job at creating tension throughout the fight. Its appearances are startling, and its disturbing hissing sounds that it emits excellently embellish the encounter and make it easily the most enjoyable encounter in the game. With so many over-the-top, grotesque bosses and enemies due to the C virus, this boss encounter kinda goes back to the basics with its design and flow, and that is something I definitely appreciate about it. True to the original game that it remakes, Resident Evil 3 Remake is an action blockbuster, showcasing the power of Nemesis as we navigate Jill Valentine through the streets of Raccoon City, spiraling out of control. Although I very much enjoyed the original game over the remake, the gameplay is quite good here, and the game's scariest moments to me came as a surprise. I went into this remake thinking moments regarding Nemesis and his appearances were going to be the scariest parts of the game, but I was proven wrong when wandering the eerie, blood-soaked halls of the hospital with Carlos. There isn't one particular moment that jumps out, but I'll narrow it down to the hunter encounters in the hospital. There are many of these monsters just roaming around the deserted hospital, and having them charge at you in the dimly lit corridors is atmospheric and spooky as hell. I really like what Capcom did with this hospital section in an otherwise very contested Resident Evil game, and for me, this section alone is the brightest moment in all of Resident Evil 3 Remake. The OG Resident Evil 4 is still one heck of a good time. Back then, the new perspective from the fixed camera angles to the over-the-shoulder perspective actually made a lot of the game feel scarier and more threatening than some of the older games in the series. That's just me speaking. I'll never forget being introduced to Dr. Salvador for the first time in the village, but perhaps the most haunting part of the entire game was towards the end in the action-heavy island section where we got introduced to the regenerators. Getting the key card in a nearby lab just to hear the abnormal, harsh breathing kick in with that eerie soundtrack was sure to shock players to the core. And if we weren't shocked and thought just taking the heads off with our fully upgraded riot gun was the best course of action, then what followed after that was sure to make us all go, "What the f***?" and book it out of there. Sporting Plagas parasites writhing within their bodies, it was difficult to know exactly where to shoot until we obtained the infrared scope, allowing the player to see exactly where these parasites resided to end these abominations for good. This whole lab section with the regenerators was just brilliantly done in the original and in the remake, and is easily one of the most haunting first encounters of any enemy type in Resident Evil's long history. The OG RE2 is still such a fantastic game, with the soundtrack, setting, and atmosphere, but the single most startling and terrifying moment in that game has to be this freaking load screen. Who would have thought a load screen could provide such horror? True to classic Resident Evil, the door sequences are a brief respite to catch one's breath or to ponder the next course of action. Well, not with this one, fellas. Not only are we met with two zombies coming right at us, but we also get the combat music kicking in at full force. It is all just so freaking abrupt and startling that really comes out of nowhere, sending players the message that we can never truly be safe at the Raccoon City Police Department. Resident Evil Revelations is a fantastic game in a creepy setting. A cruise ship infested with oozing zombies sounds like the perfect vacation, as this game first proved that over-the-shoulder gameplay can absolutely be done in cramped, narrow hallways. The encounter and the scenes with Rachel Foley as she succumbs to the T-Abyss virus are especially haunting, showing up and attacking Jill and Parker numerous times throughout the length of the game. Many of her appearances are unexpected, and fighting her in the cramped, dimly lit corridors of the cruise ship made these encounters all the creepier. The way she twitches and charges at you, screaming, is certainly not the sight you want to see, especially when it involves witnessing a former agent spiral into madness and turn hostile. Revelations is a fantastic entry in the Resident Evil franchise, and its spooky atmosphere and enemy design make this game stand out uniquely against many of the other titles.
I won't run.
While the regenerators are creepy and really well done in the remake, something has to be said about Ashley's section in Resident Evil 4 Remake. This to me is easily the most haunting section of the game, as we had to navigate a defenseless Ashley through an eerie labyrinthine library to find an item to escape, all while these clanking armaduras clash in front of, and more often behind us, as we simply try running away. Our only solace is in our lantern, with its emanating blue light able to temporarily cause these hulking metallic menaces to freeze in place. But it's when we are unable to retrieve our lantern when the true fear sets in. Planning Ashley's escape as we have her weave around a half-dozen armaduras hell-bent on taking her down was certainly adrenaline-inducing the first time around, and really shines as one of the most memorable moments in a game punctuated with incredible moments around every corner. Oh, the nostalgia. Another visit back to the Spencer Mansion and its surrounding areas, and an excellent one at that in Resident Evil 1 Remake. Not only are the graphics prettier and the controls a bit more intuitive, but the scares just stand out a bit more here. Something unique to the remake are two of my favorite new additions, the Crimson Heads and Lisa Trevor. And it is in the latter, with Lisa's slumbering, disfigured body hunting you down in her cabin in the woods, that makes this poor Umbrella test subject the scariest figure in this game. Just hearing her moans and the clashing of chains from her shackles is enough to send a sweat down your spine. You know she's there, perhaps around the corner or further off in the distance, just itching to get her hands on you like the many people she killed as a result of her torture from Umbrella, wearing the faces of her victims as a mask to hide her grotesque figure. As soon as you hear her moans and chains, get the f out of there. You don't want to have her in the Spencer Mansion. Trust me on that. This fantastic remake of the legendary Resident Evil 2 does so many things right. It appropriately translates all the tension and horror from the claustrophobic corridors of Resident Evil 2 into an over-the-shoulder format, making the zombies more formidable and threatening, while its lighting and atmosphere respectfully captures the haunting locations of the RCPD, sewers, and labs. While the freaking liquor in the interrogation room got me just as bad as it did in the original, the increased frequency of the tyrant Mr. X stalking you through the cramped corridors of the RCPD are the standout moments here. Trying to be quiet, skirting by liquors while hearing the ever louder thumps of Mr. X as he lunges towards you trying to capture you is absolutely chilling in the best way possible. The sound work in this game is just masterclass, and it especially shines when Mr. X is heard wandering the halls above or below us as we plan out our course of action to get from point A to point B. He's not as dangerous as you think when he gets a hold of you, but similar to the hunters in Resident Evil 1, you know Mr. X is out there, roaming the halls to hunt you down to the bitter end. We made it to the top 3. The action-heavy and fun-as-hell companion piece to Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3's scariest moments revolve around the game's menace of a tyrant, Nemesis. Tasked to hunt down Jill as we navigate the chaotic streets of Raccoon City, the game's scariest moments come at a time when Jill finds herself at the RCPD walking down the stairs from the second floor to the first floor of the West Wing. It is completely silent, with only the ambiance of the stormy night faintly heard beyond the RCPD's walls, and of course, Jill's footsteps, until suddenly everything gets turned to 11 when Nemesis violently enters through the window at the foot of the stairs. This moment was so unexpected, and me being in elementary school when I first played this had me nearly crush my controller, sent me faster than I thought Jill could run to the safe room next door. This is why we can thank adrenaline, folks. It comes in real handy, like at this point here. This is easily the scariest jump scare for me in all of Resident Evil, and triumphantly stands as one of the most terrifying moments in all of gaming. Resident Evil 7 is the return to horror that many of us wanted, but didn't know we wanted just like this. There are so many moments here, like Jack Baker stalking you around his estate, encountering Marguerite, etc. But one stands out scarier than all the rest, and it has to be getting the arm to create the serum. Here we make our way to the old house for the arm. Well, upon getting the arm, you see the figure of a little girl just standing there, waiting for you. It's these appearances mixed with traversing a cluttered, terrifying maze of junk with this eerie music playing in the background, hinting at something ominous to happen at just about any moment. And shit goes down. While trying to make our way out of the attic, the mold hunt you down, and there are a lot of them. It's so dark as it is that it just makes everything all the scarier. Play this in VR via PSVR 1 and you're in for easily one of the most horrifying moments in all of Resident Evil, hands down. Who knew that the game that came after it was going to follow this up with something even more nightmarish? Yep, many of us probably saw this one coming, but the scariest moment in all of Resident Evil goes to Resident Evil Village's House Beneviento. The baby. Oh baby! Wandering around a creep house with seemingly nothing of particular interest, we reach this ominous elevator in a hallway. You notice the wallpaper peeling in this hallway and an elevator just standing there, so you decide the best thing is to see where this bad boy leads us, right? Well, upon arriving at what some may claim to be their final destination, we realize that this basement is all an extravagant setup. A game, if you will, of solving cryptic puzzles in a room escape-like fashion set to Ethan's past and his relationship with Mia. That bed there in the corner, why can we crawl under it? This locker here, why can we hide in it? Because there's something lurking deep within the haunted hallways of House Beneviento. That's why. Capcom nailed this sequence better than any single horror sequence done in any other Resident Evil game. Walking down the stairs to the well, listening to a baby crying as its cries echo all throughout utter blackness. Retrieving the final piece to the puzzle, we hear a violent thud. Something is clearly not right. We make our way back towards the elevator that got us into this mess, and then out of the corner of the hallway, a massive fetus with a mouth as wide as a half-dozen toilet bowls comes charging at you, laughing and squirming awkwardly as it tries to swallow you whole. But that's not it. We need to find the fuse to power the elevator, but where did it go? We keep up the whole concept of the room escape while being hunted by this monstrosity. Hiding in lockers, hiding under a bed, coming mere inches away from this death baby, literally staring your greatest fears in the face as you ponder how to get the hell out of there. It is an incredible adrenaline rush, both of excitement, but mostly fear as you experience one of the best sequences in all of horror. Experiencing this in VR is absolutely a love letter to your adrenal glands, and if you have the means of experiencing it, don't miss out on it. There are freaky moments permeated throughout Resident Evil, but none have been done with such precision as this, making the baby sequence of Resident Evil Village's House Beneviento the scariest moment in all of Resident Evil. So there you have it, my list of Resident Evil's scariest moments. Let me know what your list is in the comments below and whether you disagree with some of my entries. Again, we all experience fear differently, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about it all in the comments. Make sure to watch this video going over the deadliest viruses and infections in all of Resident Evil, and stay tuned to the channel for even more Resident Evil content coming up. Thank you all for the awesome support, and I'll see you real soon in the next one.